They called the wind on Aegon's high hill the Queen's breath, but down in the alleys it gusted like something exhaled after a sickness, warm and sour and faintly tinged with tar. Arya moved through it as a small gray smudge of a girl, someone attired I could look at and then forget, someone who had been stamped thin by the city and could slide between the stones. The red keep glowed over her, red as if it had been built from the sunset itself, all those years and rulers weathering it into a scarp of unwilling majesty. She remembered chasing a tatter-eared cat through those same courtyards as a child, laughing, hot, scuffed, alive with a kind of courage that came only with ignorance, and the memory made everything taste like old iron. She had many names in the city. In the fish market at the mouth of Muddy Way, where the air was always damp and full of herring scales, they called her Nera because she never complained about lifting baskets that should have belonged to a broad-backed boy. In the yard of the cooper where the casks were repaired, she was just you and girl and once rat, said without malice by a man who had not learned to save his kindnesses and would die early because of it. In the kitchens of the Red Keep, where she had begun to place her steps as one places stitches, hidden, regular, she was Elna, a Merling priest's daughter who had run from a portside marriage. The lies were little shells she'd picked up and kept, and she could press them to her ear and hear the sea of them at need. 3 days she used only to watch. The city had been starved and fed so many times it no longer remembered whether smiling was a rebellion. It wore new scars over old, scaffold scars and ash scars and the pale square ghosts of banners taken down. The bells that once had pealed when someone wanted all the people brought to heel were sleeping in their towers. The gold cloaks looked like their own shadows in the morning, and by afternoon they had become rumor. Thinned, missing, replaced by men with different lions on their chests, pale cloth, red thread, hard eyes. She watched who brought the meat to the Queen's household and who smiled while they waited, who bowed too deeply, who did not bow at all because no one had taught him to bow and he did not intend to learn. She learned what she needed to know in the particular way of those who have been forced to grow without permission. The north gate of the keep, where a lane of scrub trees made a thin green brushstroke against the wall, had a door that had been painted so often the layers had cracked. Scullions went through there with baskets, and sometimes they were searched, and sometimes the men who did the searching were called away by a sergeant with a manner that said the day would end without incident. The private chapel where the Queen had candles lit for the souls of her children. Those candles were tended by a woman who had once tried to teach a girl to curtsy and had given up, laughing. The well near the old armory never ran sweet even in winter. From time to time she would find herself standing at some turn of the yard where a childhood ghost met her. Arya, skinny-kneed with hair like a nest of weeds, sprinting after a cat and startling a lady, drawing a kind of scorned music out of the mouth of a queen. If you were made of memories and cuts, the city would pick out the cuts and press them. She breathed and let the pressing tell her where her edges were. Syrio had once told her the world is water and you must learn to ride the wave that comes. The wave she rode now was low and sliding and dangerous in its quiet. On the 4th day she started to touch the edges of closed rooms. The Queen's apartments were guarded by a monster in a man-shape who wore silence as others wore a cloak. No breath fogged his visor when the nights were cool. Arya had crept close enough to see the faint seam where helm met gorget and found only a kind of absolute stillness leaking from it, cold and wrong. Men muttered about sorcery in the kitchens, but not in front of the cooks, and never before the woman in black who walked like a mapmaker measuring the world in careful steps. Qyburn, they said, as if the name itself were a stain to be scrubbed before it sank into the wood. She did not intend to test the monster's patience with foolishness. Doors could be opened without asking them, if one learned what the door wanted. This door wanted the smell of wax, the slow step of a woman who had never hurried even when she was young, the sound of prayer in a throat cured to a murmur. So Arya went to the little chapel when it was empty and pressed her palm to the cool stone where women had pressed theirs before, and then to the bronze bowl that had collected 1,000 coins that had bought 1,000 candles. She listened to how the chamber hummed, and later she watched the candle woman, how she walked, how she kept the old pox scars covered with a fringe of hair, how she had given up half her hearing when a fever took it from her and had never asked for it back. The candle woman did not come to work the next day. The city swallowed those who did not step carefully, and the way the kitchens discussed it made Arya believe the candle woman had been taken by someone with coin and purpose rather than by a sickness. It was no matter. Arya had a face rolled in linen under the bottom of a basket. Thin skin, freckled, the shape of a nose that had been broken young and badly set, and she had the faces she could make out of nothing, out of the memory of how a person had carried her bones. She put on the candle woman the way one might put on a shawl. It was more than the flesh and less than a miracle. The smell of old wax came with it, and the way the ankles ached by late afternoon, and the way regret had narrowed that woman's eyes in middle age. When the monster lifted his head and registered something at his threshold, a figure with slow feet, a careful murmur Arya let the murmur fill the narrowness between them. It was a prayer without a god, something she had learned in Bravos, a prayer that was only the counting of breath so no one would hear her count. Behind the door, she knew, there were walls hung with summer colors to keep winter out, and a table that had been a battlefield for 100 small wars, and a glass that would show a woman who had not slept because sleep was a kind of surrender. Cersei Lannister on the other side of a door had always been a kind of dream and a kind of promise. When Arya had first said the Queen's name on the road with a dirty face and a stomach that hurt as if knives had been stacked inside it, she had not expected to live long enough to turn the sound into a deed. She knew now that if she died on the far side of this attempt, the world would keep going. There would still be bread ovens and river mud and somebody pouring ale with a bent wrist to make the foam settle right. She did not want to die. She did not intend it. But the list had been a rope she held to climb out of a pit, and it had cut her palms as the rope burned through the years. You could not pretend you did not hold it. The monster stepped aside. His armor spoke in a dull whisper when he moved, as if the metal had learned to lie. Arya made herself smaller without making herself look smaller. The trick was to hollow out the room around you rather than the frame of your body. She went in, and the door closed behind with the precise care of a thing that had been designed to close exactly so. The room had warmth as part of its principle. A brazier glowed. A dish of spiced apples steamed on a plate that had been repaired with gold in the cracks. The first time Arya had seen such repair, she had told herself it was a vanity, a way of showing you had so much riches you might pour them into mending broken things, and then later she had learned it might also be the only way to keep shards together when glue would fail. The woman at the table had a goblet in her hand, nothing as heavy as the great cup the kings of old had used. Her hair was the color of wheat turned winter weak by frost, and every strand lay where it had been told to lie. "I did not ring," said the woman without looking up. "I know," said Arya in her borrowed voice. "The candles, your grace." Cersei set the goblet down with the kind of precision that carries as much meaning as a blow. "I do not need candles. I am not a child to be told that shadows will not climb on my bed if I have a flame to bully them." "It is not for you to need them," Arya said. "It is for them to be here." She could hear the dead in the room. Not their voices, but their forms. The way grief lingered on the osier chair against the wall. The way a little table had been dragged closer to the window as if someone had wanted light to do what time would not. Tommen, Myrcella, Joffrey, a name like a broken bell. Arya was not a maester to say more than that grief had shaped the air. But she could read how a woman had stood, once, beside a lattice and looked past her own reflection out to the city, as if it were some puzzle to be solved before someone snatched the pieces. "Who told you to bring candles?" Cersei asked. "When I did not ask for them?" "The wind told me," Arya said before she could stop herself. Because the borrowed woman would not have said something like that, and because sometimes truth slips out of a slit like a knife, it made Cersei's head lift, and Arya felt the attention like the weight of a thrown chain. Those eyes were clever and bright and painful, the eyes of someone who had been born convinced she could bend a world if she could only find the right fulcrum. "You," said the Queen slowly, "have you had your ears boxed for impertinence?" "Not since I was little." "You do not speak like you belong to me." Arya felt something in her chest laugh and almost hated herself for it. "I don't, your grace. My father used to say," Cersei murmured, looking down and then over the rim of the goblet, "that the ones who don't belong take what is not theirs. Are you one of those?" "Yes," Arya could have said. "I am one who takes back." But the borrowed woman might wilt at a question like that, and Arya allowed her shoulders to borrow a little of that submission. I light candles. It is the work that is mine. And my work, Cersei said, is to see the shape of other people's work. Look at me. It was a command Arya obeyed because she had obeyed worse ones, and because she wanted to see if there was anything in that face she had not already learned from the stories. It was a beautiful face, but the beauty was no longer the kind that asked to be adored. It was a beauty that challenged. The lines had taught themselves to be armor. Underneath, a kind of terror lived, the terror of someone who has been told a story since she was a little girl and cannot decide whether to break it or to let it bind her. There had been a prophecy, Arya knew. Even those who did not believe in spells believed in that one. It seemed a cruel little prybar in the hands of fate. A young queen, a pale throat, a younger brother. Arya wondered if Cersei had ever woken in the midnight and tried to wrap her own hands around her own throat to see if the shape would match. I know your work, too, Arya said softly, in the candle woman's voice. It is to be afraid and not to show it. Cersei's mouth went very still. What is your name again? Elna, your grace. No, Cersei whispered. It is not. The room made a sound, a small sound as if a board had decided to complain about a prior insult. Outside, armor sang the unmelodic tune of a shift change. Arya could feel the monster, Gregor Clegane, the undead of him, waiting. He gave the air the taste of iron filings. Later she would not be able to remember at what moment the candle woman's shoulders slipped from her and she stood straighter, nor when she put aside the particular meekness she'd borrowed to. Past the door. There are crossings you only notice when you're already across. My name is Arya Stark of Winterfell, she said, and the way Cersei's eyes widened was too small to catch, except that Arya had become the sort of person who caught such movements because they often preceded death. You once had a swordmaster killed because he stood between you and a small girl with a wooden stick. You once had a hound unleashed because a prince wanted to impress a king. You ordered a butcher's boy hunted down. I lit a candle for him. Cersei did not stand. She did not reach for the bell rope, and Arya saw with a slice of admiration that the queen had learned the art of stillness too. The butcher's boy, Cersei said. You came for him. I came for me, Arya said. I came because I have been saying your name between my teeth so long my mouth has grown used to their shape and I am tired of the taste. I came because the woman you are has made the world worse for the girls who will grow to be women after us. I came because I don't know what I become if I don't do this. Cersei's gaze slid toward the goblet and then away, as if she were disciplining an impulse. You think you end a story by killing a character, she said dryly. Every child thinks that, but the story goes on. Cut one head and two more grow. You should learn from the snakes across the sea. I did, Arya said. I learned you can cut deeper. Cersei laughed, a soft, unhappy sound. Did you think I would beg? I begged once in my life. I will not do it twice. You never begged, Arya said. You negotiated. Girl, Cersei said, and the word was not spoken to Arya, but to some invincible fear she had nursed so long it had grown to the size of a companion. If you are Arya Stark, you could have been a lady with land. You could have had daughters who did not know the weight of knives. You could have had sons who did not ride to die before their voices settled. You are here in a borrowed skin. Does that feel like victory to you? Arya had not expected to feel sorry for the queen. The pity prickled her. It made her distrust her hands. No, she said. It feels like finishing one stitch because if I don't the whole cloth frays. You've rehearsed that speech, Cersei said, and now her pride lit her face with the kind of loveliness that burns last in the fire. Have you rehearsed the part where you leave? Have you rehearsed the monster at my door? Arya glanced at the brazier. The glow there was a quiet held in a bowl. She had planned for the door. The candle woman never came without her iron key that turned an inner lock the monster could not breach. The queen's chamber had been designed to keep men out, not women in. Some part of that pleased Arya. I have rehearsed all of it, she said. The list is rehearsal that never ends. Cersei's mouth flicked. Tyrion kept a list once. Books he'd read. He thought that made him wise. He is clever, Arya said. That is not the same thing. Cleverness is a false coin, Cersei said. almost sad, as if she had once loved the minting of it. "I know," Arya said, and then she moved because the only way to keep the hands from shaking is to let them split the air. Needle was small and narrow as a held breath. Arya had hidden it in the wicker that held the candle stubs. She had learned to take the time she needed from the minutes other people threw away. She crossed the space between them in the quiet that mice used to scurry past sleeping cats. Cersei watched her come and did not flinch. It occurred to Arya with a shock like a cold hand on the back of her neck that the queen had always believed she would die this way. In a room that smelled of fruit, not in a ring of men. By a girl's hand, not an army's. "I once thought it would be my brother," Cersei said softly. "I thought death would know me when it saw me because I'd known him first. But there you are. You are no brother. Are you mercy, then? Or are you justice?" "You weren't merciful," Arya said. "And you are not a judge." "No," Arya said. "Only a girl with a knife." She went for the throat because it is the place of breath, and if the world requires anything, it requires breath. She was precise, tidy. The blade slid in where the thumb felt the flutter. Cersei drew a breath and then lost it. There was blood. There is always blood. It came hot and dark on Arya's hand and then cooler. Cersei put her hand over Arya's as if they were partnered in some dance. The queen had never learned to be common in anything. She looked at Arya as if they were the only two people living, and her eyes filled with something that was not fear. It was not forgiveness either. It was the dawning understanding that the world had been about to hand her a different end, and it had changed its mind to accommodate a girl the world had underestimated. Cersei fell like a curtain coming down after a last act. Arya eased her to the floor because she could not bear to hear the body strike wood. The room continued to be a room. The brazier popped once. The monster outside was still as a mural. The goblet did not spill because Cersei had set it too far out of reach. Arya was not crying. She thought she should be and found she was empty of water. She had cried this out long ago, in the dark belly of an inn, when she had heard about her father. She had cried when she had watched smoke with somewhere her brother inside it. She had used up those tears. She listened. A small scuffle in the corridor. A servant hurrying past. She rose and went to the inner door and turned the bolt that would buy her the time she needed. The face she had brought for afterward was rolled and ready. It was always hardest to put on a person who was still warm. The memory pressed too hard. She worked slow, careful, her hands sure because they had done worse things in worse rooms. The queen's face surprised her. It was like lifting a mask to find another mask under it. Finer, more delicate. She felt for a breath the weight of children and the tilt of wine in the mouth and the sudden yawning space where a father used to be. She had never liked to dwell in other people more than she must. She did not sink in. She only skimmed, skated the surface, took the shape and left the contents. When she was finished, she stood and walked once around the room to learn the balance of this new body. The hips told a different story than hers. They had carried more ceremony than running. The mouth threatened to sneer of its own accord. She had to teach it not to. She arranged the dress so it sat right. She tucked her mangled hands, hers, not Cersei's, so the scars did not show when the sleeves dragged up. Arya inside the queen, went to the table and lifted the goblet. She put it down again. She crossed to the door and unbolted it. She slid it open halfway. "Sire," she said, and her voice was the queen's voice, amber and sharp. "Send Qyburn to me." The monster did not speak. He turned the motion of his head, and the guard down the hall scuttled like a small animal toward the stairs. Arya went to the window and looked out because she needed the air, because she needed to remind herself the city was there and this room was not the whole of the world. The red keep lay over the city like a hand, and the city lay under it like a patient who has learned the art of breathing without making a sound. The river wrote its shining snake through it, and the mud writhed where carts had pressed their letters. She remembered standing at a different window in that same keep, small and more full of hunger and fear than she had learned to be. A bird flew under her and flared upward on a current. It seemed a foolish triumph that such small creatures could use the same wind as kings. Qyburn came in on quick feet and then checked himself, bowing. He took up less space than his hands wanted. He considered his fingers, slipped them together, and tucked them against his belly. He smiled as if he had never done it before and was practicing. "Your Grace requested me." "Close the door," Arya said. "Linger the guards farther down the hall." Qyburn made a tiny gesture. This was a man who had taught the world to follow his smallest moves and convinced it that not to do so was the same as impoliteness. He approached the middle of the room and stopped with the exactness of a man who has measured distances all his life. His gaze fell to the goblet, lifted, flicked. He had the air of a rat that had eaten poison so long it no longer tasted it. "You look rested, Your Grace," he said. "And you look like your mouth is full of needles," Arya said. And the words came out with so much of Cersei's disdain that Arya felt the odd double sensation of being both amused and ashamed. "I require letters. I will dictate. Call for parchment. A steady hand. A man with a fast horse and a quiet nature." "For what ends?" Qyburn asked, and though the words were humble, the needle points in them were not. "For the West." Arya sat. "The Queen's back did it beautifully. There are Lannisters at the Rock who must be brought to heel. There are cousins who will forget they owe me fealty unless I remind them. I have decided to gather the house in. Summon them. Cousins, offshoots, debtors, seekers, any with lion blood or the rumor of it. A feast, Qyburn. A feast to make the Rock echo. Write that I will come myself, when the matters of the city have been tidied." Qyburn hesitated. He had the humorless sense of danger of a man who has spent his life noticing the single thread out of place. "Your Grace's words are swords," he said with an oblique smile. "May I ask what enemy prompts this sudden hospitality?" Arya held him with Cersei's eyes and thought, briefly, of what would happen if she were to kill him where he stood. The monster outside would not move quickly, but he would move surely. The city would be a fist closing. She would not reach the hill again. She had to keep Qyburn alive for now because some doors need keys you dislike holding. "Rumor is the enemy," she said. "Rumor of weakness. Rumor that I will not spend to make my kin remember me." "Ah," Qyburn said. He went to the little table and set down his instruments. Ink, a fine-nibbed pen, his little sand shaker, a stick of red wax. "The house must be gathered to prove the house exists." "Yes," he wrote. His hand had the steadiness of a surgeon's. He did not look at her while he pulled the letters from her mouth. He had learned to separate the words from the woman. When one of the words came awkwardly, when Arya felt the shape snag as her own habit fought with the Queen's, Qyburn's eyes flicked up just once and his mouth tightened. He thought she had been drinking. He would think so because his mind had been made to hold certain structures and no others. When it was done, he sanded the letters and rolled them while the ink still smelled like the inside of a storm. He sealed them and stamped them with a lion. He looked up. "Shall I have the Lord Commander attend you?" he asked, and Arya sensed the unspoken portion of the sentence. "To keep you from wandering from the path we have laid for you. The Lord Commander needs to visit the barracks and remind the men their pay will come regardless of what the streets whisper," Arya said. "Do not summon him. Tell him I command him, in writing." "As your grace commands," Qyburn said smoothly. He waited. "Shall I have the candles taken?" "Leave them," Arya said. "Let them burn." He left with his rat-footed efficiency. Arya stood again and let the Queen slide down her as if she were slipping out of a wet dress. The face went back into its role. She washed her hands in a basin and added more rose water than the room had used earlier so the next person who came would think Cersei had lingered there longer. She looked down at the body on the floor and felt, finally, something hot snag in her chest and come undone, like a knot giving understeady. Fingers. She did not know whether it was sorrow or relief. She gave the Queen one last mercy. She folded hands across the chest and tidied the hair. Death was a kind of company and deserved respect for that alone. She went out by the inner door and down the passage she had memorized when she was a child for no reason she could have explained. The castle had secret ways because kings had secrets. Arya knew some of them, and others had learned to be found by her. She took a stair that turned like a shell and came to a door that breathed the old sea. The rock might be far away, but every castle remembered its bones. She slipped her small body through it, out to a narrow gallery, across to a curtained niche where a carving had been cut into the wall and then plastered over when someone had decided it told the wrong story. Behind the plaster was a seam. Behind the seam, an old space with dust and a mouse's nest and a drop into a darkness that smelled of wet and moss. She went down, one hand, one foot, the other hand, the other foot, and came into a place where the light wore itself thin. When at last she was in the kitchens again, the heat made her feel like a fruit about to be turned into jam. She put on Elna's shoulders again and took up a basket and filled it with unsliced loaves and carried them into a room where no one who mattered to her was looking. She did not see herself as she must have looked. Sweat trampolines on her brow, eyes over keen, a little shiver in the corner of her mouth. She saw only the work and the exit and the street and the hill. Outside, the sky had tired of being blue and considered being yellow. The city held its breath, and because it had been taught to do so, it did it with a certain elegance. A newsmonger shouted in a voice like a crow's. A boy threw a stone at a stray dog and the stone missed and hit the shutters of a money changer's, and the money changer walked out and hit the boy and then went back inside, and no god altered his hand as he did it. The river carried a single green bottle like a small ship with no passengers. It was a day that would not remember itself unless someone forced it to. Arya made herself eat cheese hard and dear, a plum that had been bruised in the basket and had given up its perfume as a way of claiming a long day's victories. Water that might once have been wine poured back and forth so often it had forgotten what it wanted to be. She felt grainy with exhaustion. She wanted to sleep and could not sleep because sleep would dissolve the choices she had made into dream logic, and she would wake unsure of the boundary between the two. She wanted to find a place in the city large enough to contain both the girl she had been and the woman she had just agreed to be. It might have ended there, Cersei cooling on the rushes, a city with a wound it did not know about yet. But the world has a way of adding to itself. By dusk a rumor began to move through the streets, slow and stealthy, attaching itself to other rumors like a creeping vine. The queen was ill. The queen had babbled. The queen had cut her hand on a slip of glass while doing nothing that a queen should do. The queen had given an order that contradicted another order and then denied both orders. Arya heard it at a corner where a brass worker leaned out to kiss his wife with the calm air of one who had learned to steal sweetness when it presented itself. She walked as the rumor walked and learned where it gathered force. A girl with a red apron said the queen had spoken in a northern accent for one phrase and then stopped, startled like a cat when it hears its own name. Arya smiled with half her mouth and did not show teeth. She slept that night in a space the city had forgotten. Behind a boarded door in a dead scribe's shop where the cases had been emptied when the man died and where dust danced in a pale shaft as if it had found a church and meant to worship. She lay on the floor and did not dream. When she woke, morning had cooled her thoughts enough that she could sort them. The letters would be moving west already. Ravens would be beating their wings to the rock and beyond. Riders would put the queen's words into the mouths of innkeepers and posted masters. So many little lines in the air, tying the world together, and all of them made by someone's hunger to be obeyed. She had thought, sometimes, standing on the deck of a Braavosi ship with salt drying the spaces in her hair, that she might choose to be done. That she might look west and see the pale line of uncertainty like a hand on the horizon and go toward it and let the land be done with her. There had been a coin in her pocket then that had more meaning than weight. She found it now, rolled it between her fingers and put it back. Not yet. She had begun a thing that would not end of its own accord. The sea could wait with its wide mouth open. In Winterfell, far away and north, because distance is a way of being that does not ask permission from hearts, a raven came down on cold air with a letter that made Sansa Stark's eyes narrow and softened by turns. She dismissed her counselors to the next room and read it twice at the table her father had used. She traced one phrase with a finger and then the next. The queen invites me to gather. The queen calls for kin. The queen returns west. All that in the business's measured round, but the tone beneath it, a certain ferocity disguised as family, pricked at Sansa. She thought of her sister with an ache that was not the ache of a wound, but the ache of a muscle that had been used until it had been made to grow. Arya had always been a knife while Sansa had been a net. Nets are kinder and knives cleaner. That was all. She told herself she was being foolish to think of Arya. Then she told herself she was being less foolish than usual. She called for the maester and for parchment and for a steady hand, because if the south was moving, the north had to know in what rhythm the south danced. "Do you suspect a trap?" the maester asked, and Sansa saw herself from the outside. Taller now, her face more spare, her hair woven not because she had been told to but because it steadied her hands. She heard her own voice answer, and it sounded like someone's mother and someone's queen and someone's sister. "Every gathering is a trap," she said evenly. "Whether it snaps on your neck or your enemies depends on who does the inviting and who does the cooking." The maester's mouth twitched. "Shall I prepare an answer that refuses the honor?" Sansa folded the letter and placed it beneath a stone. "No. Prepare an answer that requests more time, and send a rider south with eyes that are his own and not in someone else's keeping. I want to know who signed this, not only what stamp pressed it." "And Lady Arya?" he asked delicately, and Sansa had that moment of pure, heavy knowing that sometimes arrived with letters, the moment when the air in the hall seemed to change density because of a sentence very far away. "You will say I hope she is as she always was," she replied. "Impossible." On Dragonstone, a man who had once held his cup, as if it contained the cure for the world, took a letter from a squire whose hands had not yet learned not to shake when they presented something dangerous. Tyrion Lannister read it and felt a bone-deep freezing begin in him that had nothing to do with winter. He drank water to ensure he could not be accused of drinking wine, and the taste of the water made him think of all the ways water carries away what you throw into it and yet sometimes throws it back. He remembered his father's hand on a cup. He remembered his brother laughing, and the laugh had cut like a blade into the air. "The Queen calls the house," he said aloud, because sometimes saying a sentence aloud is the only way to know if it is true. He closed his eyes for a moment and saw rooms in Casterly Rock, the way the light fell through slits onto stone, the way a boy's playthings had been set aside and then not touched for years because no one had dared. He saw that boy's face and wondered whether he would ever decide to forgive it. Beside him, the woman who had dragons frowned, and Tyrion thought how the world had gathered itself into questions all too elegantly. If the lion tried to stand again, where would the dragon plant her feet? If the lion fell finally, would the world be done with all those who had used its roar as currency? He did not fool himself that the death of a woman would settle debts older than her children. He did not fool himself that a girl from the north could end anything except herself if she was not careful. "Shall we send condolences?" Daenerys asked in that bone-clean voice whose edges Tyrion had learned and failed to predict 100 times. He stared at the letter. It did not announce mourning. It announced a celebration. It announced the drawing of lines. "No," he said. "We will send a ship to drift in the bay below the rock. It will appear to have lost its way. It will have eyes, and we will wait. Waiting is not my favorite cure for anything," she said. Her hand touched the windowsill and did not move. "It is sometimes the only one that does not worsen the disease," Tyrion said. He went to the little place he had claimed in the castle, a corner that had not been a corner once, and set the letter on the table and watched how the candlelight found its raised bits. He told himself the Queen was too vain to summon everyone for a reason other than applause. He told himself she was too careful to gather all members of her house in one place. No one did that anymore. It had made too many songs. He told himself a dozen moves on 4 different boards and saw all the ways they would go wrong. He wondered if that made him wise or only someone who had learned to admire his own caution. In King's Landing, a rook perched and hopped and flew. The city began to change its hum. The palace whispers turned into lines in a small book held by a woman who sold tidings the way other women sold ribbons. "The Queen is in," she would say, tapping one line with her nail. "And then the Queen is out," she would say, tapping another, and her customers would nod as if knowledge were a scarf they had tried on and found suited them surprisingly well. Arya walked these streets as herself, and as Elna, and as other small mouths. She listened to what she had set in motion and measured the size of it. She did not yet know if she could be Cersei often, if the weight of that face would sink her. It would be useful, too useful, to set aside. She did not make that decision in the street. She went instead to the river one evening and stood at the place where the bank had been undercut and the water had carved out a cave of air. The river spoke the language all rivers speak. If you stop me, I gather, and then I drown you. She thought of the rock again, and of Casterly's tunnels that she had trailed like rumors when she was a child in the keep and had not yet learned that the whole world had tunnels. She thought of the cousins who would come, the uncles, the men with half a lion, and the ones who had minted themselves whole from scraps. She had taken it upon herself to end a house, and she did not know whether she meant to end the blood or end the story. Faces had taught her that stories are only as long as their tellers live. But she had been a child too, and children have a way of wanting to do the thing all the way, because half will not do when you have been denied. The next morning she wore Cersei again. It came easier. That frightened her. She spoke with Qyburn, who noted in the smallest corner of his mouth that the queen was drinking less. There was praise in it, and there was calculation. She let him think whatever would carry him through his day. She listened to complaints about coin, about gates, about bakers who cut their bread with sawdust and swore it came from an imported barley. She signed decrees with a hand she did not recognize and wondered how many lists she would need to keep before she lost track of which were hers. She kept her hand away from the bell rope. She kept her hands, as a general rule, where she could see them. Sometimes, when Qyburn's head was bent, she looked into the mirror, and Cersei looked back with eyes that were hers and were not hers. She thought, briefly and with a sudden pain like a sprain, that she might have pitied her, if pity had any use in the world that had made them both. She thought of Sansa and wondered if her sister would forgive this. She thought of her father and knew he would not, because he would want her to choose a path that did not turn on deception even when every other path did. She thought of Jon and of the cold air whose taste had never been unkind and of the way sorrow had taught him to speak like someone older than he was. She thought of a wolf under trees and a girl under a city and how both had learned how to take meat without waking a camp. On the 4th day after the death of the queen, she walked the stone veranda that looked south and listened to a pair of little maids talking while they rubbed oil into the wood. One said, in a voice that had not learned the art of discretion, that the queen was like a cat who had been set down and found the ground warmer than expected. The other laughed and said the queen had smiled at a boy, a real smile, and the boy had dropped his towel and stammered and made a kind of poetry in his apologies. Arya heard herself smile and then stopped it by folding it in. "Your Grace," Qyburn said at her shoulder, having learned to appear like a blot over clean parchment, "the Lord Commander begs an audience. There is trouble with pay." "Is there ever not?" she said dryly. "He claims the men will not go where they are asked to go," Qyburn murmured. "They say the queen is not herself." Arya did not let her breath catch. "The queen," she said, "was never herself. She was a throne with legs. Tell the Lord Commander that gold has been set aside. He may see it with his own eyes. Tell him I will show him myself." Qyburn blinked. His mind made little shapes that added up to a figure he could not recognize. "In the treasury?" he asked carefully. "In the treasury," Arya said. "We will count lions. We will weigh how heavy a house is." The treasury had the smell of old metal and mouse droppings and a faint tang that might have been fear. The Lord Commander, a man Arya had not seen from close since she had learned how to become a shadow, stood as if his boots had built themselves into the floor. He bowed with the stiffness of someone who had been taught not to trust the air above his ankles. She saw his suspicion and she did not care about it. Suspicion was a neutral weather that had settled over this city in her absence and would settle again when she left. She wanted him to see what she meant him to see. That there were casks, that there were coin, that there were ledgers, that when she touched the wax and pressed it with the lion's ring her hand did not tremble. She stood beside a cask, split the top, and plunged her hand into a knee-deep glitter. The coin slid cool and heavy along her forearm. She could feel its weight. Tywin's wealth, the rock's heart's blood, interest and timber and loan and murder translated into roundness and clink. She withdrew her hand and let a stream of gold fall in a small cascade that made the air look as if it had acquired a private sun. The Lord Commander's face changed. Men are easier to move when they think your weight is measured in the small hard things they have been taught to desire. "Do you see?" Arya asked him. "I see," he said, and whether he had seen the coin or the control, she did not bother to learn. He bowed more deeply. After, she went back to the queen's chambers and washed the gold dust from her skin and thought about how wealth can be an argument heavier than any moral case. She took the face off. She hid it. She stretched her own face and let it settle, like a piece of leather that had been folded too long. She fell asleep in a chair with her head tipped back and dreamt that she was walking through a hallway full of doors. Some had her name on them. Some had names she could not read because they were in another alphabet. At an end of the hall, a door had a lion painted on it, and the lion's paint was fresh, and the lion looked tired. She opened the door and found the sea. She woke with an ache in her neck that reminded her she had not been made to be comfortable in such rooms. She stood, and the room stood with her. She went to the window and saw a pigeon strut on the balustrade with the foolish arrogance of creatures who have to invent pride to keep from realizing they are prey. She thought of a time she had thrown a pigeon into a pot and had eaten with such hunger she had adored it. She wondered at the measure of change between that girl and this woman and decided the difference was not as large as weather. She wrote a small letter in her own hand on coarse paper and left it where a careful eye might find it, because sometimes you must say truth where even lies will fail. It said only, "Sister, I did a thing that cannot be undone. I am not sorry. I am not proud. I am what they made me, and I am what I make myself. If you do not know me, know this: I am between breaths and will choose the next one. If you send word, send it folded twice in green twine. Burn after." She wanted to send it. She did not. She folded it and tucked it into a seam of the chimney where the smoke would not take it, and where a mouse might find it a year from now and turn it into a bed. It made her feel better to have written it, even if words never reached their marks. A word is a kind of arrow. It either finds its mark or it misses and becomes part of the world. At dusk, she walked the hill again as herself and let her feet choose. They took her to the place where the city thins into river and the steps sink. A child crouched there, patient, holding a length of string with a hook at the end and a bit of fat. The child was of that thin, pale kind that grows only in cities where the weather comes from mouths. Arya crouched near and watched the water's surface as if it might confess. "What do you hope to catch?" she asked after a time. "Luck," the child said. "When you catch it, will you know?" Arya said. The child grinned. "If it wriggles," the child said. "If it tries to get away, what will you do then?" "Hold on," the child said simply. The string twitched. The world kept breathing. When the letters reached the west, Casterly Rock answered as it had been taught to answer, by arranging its own walls into music. Cousins in gold bands looked over their wives' shoulders and did not tell them what was written there. Boys who had been taught to ride and to aim a spear and to recite their grandparents' names fetched their riding cloaks and hoped their mothers would forbid them, and then hoped they would not. A man who had made his fortune selling iron nails put his hand on the letter and thought of how much wood you could fasten with the right piece of metal. He smiled, thinking of tables. At a farm so far back from the road could be forgotten in winter. A woman with a lion ring she did not wear because it scraped the butter churn's edge smoothed the letter on the table and said to her husband, "The Queen knows us." And her husband, who had wanted to die anonymous, did not say what rose in his throat. In the city, the small woman who sold tidings like ribbons said to the men who gave her coin that there were riders going west like the last of the starlings. In the palace, Qyburn checked a ledger and made a total that pleased him, because it suggested something could be measured and therefore something could be controlled. Arya waited, and in waiting she learned something about herself that she had not wanted. She learned she had become a person who could be patient when patience was a weapon. She took in air and let it out and did not speak the list for 2 whole days because she was afraid of turning it into a song that would own her. She spoke it then, quietly, under her breath. It came out unsurprised, as if it had been waiting. When on the 8th day a boy with hair like straw was caught in the outer yard of the keep with a pocket full of coins stamped with the wrong face, Arya listened while the Lord Commander roared and the boy stammered, and Qyburn watched with the cool interest of a man who had once been a child and had learned to distrust them. The boy said a man had paid him to ask questions, and that the man had a scar in the shape of a hook beside his nose, and that the man wanted to know if the queen had taken to wearing soft shoes and speaking softly because his own mother did that before she died. The boy said the man had dropped the lion coin and called it a liar's trinket, and then had bent down and picked it up and kissed it and put it in the boy's hand as if it were a good luck charm rather than something that might cost him a wrist. Arya's mouth dried. Tyrion. It might be Tyrion's man or one of the men who wanted to be. It did not matter. The West was waking and the world had many ears. That night, as the moon rose uninterested above the city and a dog fought a dog somewhere for a scrap, Arya walked as Cersei to the balustrade and stood with her hands set on the stone. She had thought that wearing a queen would feel like standing under a weight. It felt more like a mantle of obligations. A queen was expected to scowl and to bless in equal measure. A queen could sign the letter that made a gathering and then be its destiny and its doom. She looked at the city and let the face teach her, for once, rather than the other way round. It taught her that loneliness is a throne, that power is hunger that never finishes its meal. She took off the face and pressed it to the stone and watched it hold its shape for a moment before flattening like the memory of an expression. She put it away. She stood there as Arya Stark, whose father had told her the words of their house and had believed they meant something you could stand on. "I will end you," she said to the dark. "Not you because you are done. The you of you, the noise you make, the echo when you're gone." The dark did not reply. It did not need to. She did not know whether she meant murder or the careful starving of a story. She had learned in Bravos that some deaths are more exact without blades. She had learned in the Riverlands that some wrongs can be paid back with coins no one sees. She turned away from the balustrade and went inside. From here the path ran west. The letters were already a path. She would have to walk it with as many faces as the journey required. She would have to gather the hungry lions in their den and feed them with a feast they would remember for a night and the world would remember for as long as it remembered tales. She would have to choose at the last moment whether to be the kind of justice that ends a name or the kind of mercy that lets it dwindle to a tale that frightens children into washing their hands. She slept. The river under the hill kept moving. In the morning, a man with a face that had learned not to catch light came to her with a message from a ship that had drifted into the bay and had drifted out and had not been inspected because the harbormaster's fifth wife had had a child who took a long time learning to breathe, and there had been more important matters to attend. The message was nothing, which told Arya a good deal. The dragons were watching. She put the message in a drawer and did not lock the drawer. She would leave soon. On the day she chose, she rose before dawn and dressed in a traveling dress that had the memory of salt in it. She tucked needle where it belonged and rolled the queen and hid her deep. She tied her hair back and let it be what it was, a dark line over her shoulder. She looked at the room and saw that nothing in it belonged to her. She took a slice of the spiced apple and ate it standing there, tasting sweet and cinnamon and the sharp of clove. She picked up the letter she had not sent and put it in her breast under her leather where it would warm on her skin. She left by the old stair that had been built for a king with a limp and came out into the morning when the market was being born. Vendors were taking the lids off their songs. Smoke out of 100 kitchens made a single shawl. The city did not notice her, and that was both its crime and its kindness. She threaded herself into the road that went west and felt the pull of the rock like a magnet working through earth. As she walked, she kept her head down as someone careful with themselves does. She thought of faces she had worn and faces she had refused. She thought of a boy with a hammer who had asked her once if she could choose anything, what would she choose, and how she had not been able to make her mouth form the word peace because it had sounded too much like giving up. She thought of Sansa's hands folding a letter and how beautifully she would do it. She thought of Tyrion's eyes when he learned something ugly and made a joke out of it because that was the only way he knew to keep from breaking. She wondered if their paths would cross at the rock. She wondered if he would try to stop her. She wondered what it would cost her not to let him. The road bent. A heron lifted its long, ancient body from a winter-brown reed bed and presented the morning with its ridiculous legs as a kind of offering. Arya smiled, a small, self-forgetting thing. She adjusted the strap of her pack. She put one foot and then the other on the stones that had been laid by men who were dust now. The day ran beside her and then a little ahead. The wind came up. Somewhere not far a woman called a name out loud the way a bell would call. Arya's name was not in it. She walked. The west opened. The story, which had always been going on whether she chose to join it or not, made space for her footfall without fuss. She did not look back at the Red Keep because birds do not look back at the tree they have just left. She did not touch the coin in her pocket because she did not need a god to say yes or no. She did not tell herself what ending meant because she had learned that endings are a place where people meet and decide whether to keep walking. The house she would end, if she ended it, would end because she had learned to be a woman who could hold a knife steady and a silence steady and a plan steady. The child who had chased a cat in a castle would never have believed how well she would learn to do both. On the second day out of the city, when the river had turned into a tale told in the distance and the road had become less peopled with those who had nowhere to go and more peopled with those who had chosen their direction, Arya saw a trail of dust that did not belong to the earth. She stepped into a copse of alder and waited because caution is a skill that improves with practice. A small train of riders came by with the quiet cheerfulness of men who had not yet been told to die for a cause. Their leader wore a reddish cloak with a lion stitched in thread, almost too pale to see in this light. Cousins, offshoots, an uncle. Their faces were proud of something that had happened before they were born. Arya watched their backs pass and felt the list inside her twitch as if it were reminding her it was not done writing itself. Night came. The stars moved as they always had, without regard. The moon practiced being full. On a hill without a name, she made a small fire in a hole she had dug and shielded with stones as if from old habit. And she ate bread and cheese again. And she watched the fire the way you might watch a face you had not decided whether to love. She spoke a name into the dark because the dark holds secrets and gives them back changed. Cersei, she said, and found it easier now, as if she had put down something heavy and was walking above her own shadow. She slept with her back to a rock and her knife under her hand and woke before dawn because the world is still the world even when you have reached into it and moved something. The east was faintly silver. The west was a question. She stood and stretched. She put her face in the direction of the sea and felt a pull so deep it was like someone had fastened a line inside her and was taking it up inch by inch. She allowed that pull for a breath, then set it aside because to follow it now would be to break what she had just begun. She started walking again. The road bent and deepened and then lifted. Once, a fox stood with its paw lifted, considering her with a quick little brain that weighed her against hunger. She stared back. The fox decided she was not meat and loped away. She thought briefly of Nymeria and the way choosing to let go can be a hardness and a freedom at once. She passed a farm where a child stood at a fence and sucked the air as if the air itself were a kind of sweet and waved without smiling. Arya waved back. This was the sort of courtesy that keeps the world from turning into a thing with too many teeth. It would be a long road to the rock. There would be inns with stale beer and rooms with straw that needed to be shaken and laughter that came as a relief because someone else had made it. There would be nights she wore other faces because they opened doors, and there would be a morning when she could not recall which face had kissed a boy to stop him asking a question he would regret asking. There would be a feast that would require a hand steadier even than hers had been, and a decision that could not be forged in anyone else's fire. She walked toward that as one walks toward a tide, not in a hurry because the sea does not care about speed. The list inside are said names she had not written yet, and she told it to be quiet until she asked for it. The sun peeled itself off the horizon and rose, and the world, which has always had more to do than attend to a girl with a knife, went on with its tasks. Arya added her steps to it. She had killed a queen and put on her face and written to a castle to gather a house, and yet, at that hour between one thing and the next, she felt no bigger than the string a child used to fish for luck. She decided to hold on when it wriggled. She went on.